Okay. Okay. Let's see. Okay, folks. Well, so remember, Aquinas' 5 ways are basically 5 ways to prove God's existence. The first 3 are versions of the cosmological argument, the argument that says God is needed as a necessary first cause of the cosmos, hence cosmological. I told you that even though that was presented in the video, we're not going over that just for reasons, just for time constraints. The 4th way I usually never do, but the 5th way is a very simple early statement of the design argument, and it gives some of the basics of that argument. You know, and I said, if we're going to do anything, I like us to do the design argument if for no other reason than that it's been in the news so much the past few years with, controversies about whether so-called intelligent design ought to be taught along with evolution in the public K through 12 school system. And they had a big debate in Pennsylvania over this, and there's I think it's a Nova show that I have linked to in your extra credit thing. If this interests you, you could always do an extra credit on it. Okay, so the 5th way, why can't things in nature direct themselves toward a goal? Another name for the design argument is the teleological argument. Teleological. From the Greek word telos, for an end or goal or purpose.
Can you spell that again?
From telos. And just like Aristotle, we'll see that Aquinas and Paley, who are both influenced, perhaps Aquinas more strongly than Paley, by Aristotle, they see purposes in nature and they see God as the reason there are things in nature with built-in purposes. So why can't things in nature direct themselves toward the purposes that they serve? Well, Aquinas' answer is they are not intelligent. They don't have intelligence or understanding within themselves. Hence, since they are not intelligent themselves, things in nature can't direct themselves toward the goals that they serve by themselves. And the conclusion is that they need an external intelligence to do that. So why do things in nature, so what do things need? Well, I just answered that question. The answer is they need an external intelligence to enable them to serve the purposes that they serve. And this is what Aquinas illustrates with an archer shooting an arrow and the claim that the arrow, since the arrow has no intelligence within itself, it needs an intelligent external force, an intelligent archer, to direct it towards the goal, which is the target. But again, goals here are also meant as the purposes or ends that things serve, like the parts of our bodies and plants and what have you. Paley points this out much more specifically. So who fulfills the need of being this external intelligence? Well, for Aquinas, there's only one real answer to this, and that is God as God is portrayed in the Judeo-Christian tradition. God, the God of the Bible and for him, church tradition. So there's Aquinas' simple statement. Now, Paley goes into much more detail, but essentially he makes the same point over and over again. I mentioned that I once had a copy of Paley's Natural Theology that I had bought, and it was from the early 1800s. His first edition came out in 1802. And it was more interesting than a lot of philosophy books to look at because he had a lot of line drawings, pen and ink drawings of various parts of the anatomy of plants and animals, trying to essentially make the same point. That here are parts of things in nature that are like the watch. So what about the watch made it different from the stone? I had somebody ask me these, and I said we're going to go over them, but I gave her some short answers. But essentially, the watch, unlike the stone, had a series of parts coordinated together, working together to enable it to fulfill a specific function. In other words, in an old tick-tock watch, all the gears and springs are coordinated together to enable the hands to move in exact ways that allow us to use the watch for the function of being a timepiece, telling time. Right? So, why does this difference apply a different answer as to its origins than what we would say for the watch or the stone? Well, Paley says, look, there's no problem in most of us if we see a stone in a field, or if you're walking across campus, right, and you look down and there are some broken twigs, and there are a few pebbles, and some grass. There's no problem for any of us to conclude that that stuff got there purely as a result of natural forces. And Paley says, look, this stone, for all we know, could have been there forever. But he says we would not want to draw the same conclusion about the watch that we did about the stone. And why? Because of those intricate parts. In other words, if you're walking across campus and you look down, and besides seeing some broken twigs and stones and some grass, you also see a ballpoint pen laying there on the ground, you wouldn't say to yourself, well, isn't this interesting? The forces of nature in this little area, besides being responsible for some twigs and stones on the ground, somehow the forces of nature work together to create a ballpoint pen here. No, we wouldn't say that, would we? We would say, because this has parts that work together to enable it to serve a particular function, just like the watch. And we would say, well, a pen didn't get there as a result of the forces of nature, and neither did Paley's watch. He said basically we would want to conclude that the watch was designed and built so that all those gears and mechanisms work together to enable it to serve those purposes. In other words, that it's the design and the intentions of an external intelligence, and here, that are responsible for the watch being what it is. Here we're talking human intelligence. Now, why is this an argument from analogy? Well, an argument from analogy basically compares two or more things and points out similarities that they have. And that's the premise, or the premises of your argument from analogy, is observation of those similarities, but then the argument goes on from there to say, well, if these things are alike in these ways, might they then be alike in further ways, or at least one further way that's not as obvious? So what are we comparing here in Paley? Well, Paley says everything that we've said about the watch can be said for a structure like the human eye. Paley's very enamored with the eye, but he talks about other parts of our anatomy too as being things that function together to serve a purpose. In other words, like the watch, the eye has intricate parts that work together to enable it to fulfill a particular function. So those are the similarities in your argument from analogy, and you say, well, probably, if they're similar in that respect, we know that something like the watch needed an external intelligence to design and build it so that all of those intricate parts work together to serve the purpose or function they serve. So, and here's where we go to the main conclusion, so wouldn't something in nature like the eye that also has those similarities have the additional similarity of having needed an external intelligence, i.e. God, to design it so that all of those parts work together to fulfill the purposes that it fulfilled? And that, that's basically Paley's version of the analogy. And I'll talk about some of the responses to this later when we look at Hume next. So that's the analogy. Just as there are man-made objects that have parts that work together intricately to enable them to serve various functions, so there are things in nature that seem to have those same characteristics. Therefore, if man-made things needed an external intelligence to design and build them so that all those parts work together to serve the purposes they serve, why wouldn't things in nature then need an external intelligence? Now, the design argument is probabilistic at best. It is not meant to be an airtight argument like the ontological argument, where to accept the premises and deny the conclusion would lead you into an outright contradiction. At best, even if the design argument works, it only shows that with some probability a God exists as a designer of the universe. Now, Hume tries to chew into this argument which we'll see in just a second. Now, I know I say David Hume, design argument, and the problem of evil. We didn't cover the problem of evil. It's not. I'm not going to ask you questions on that. So you just strike that out in your mind. Okay. Which happens any other time I have napkins. Oh, all right. Cup. And the tape is rolled, but that's okay. All right. So where are we going with this? So David Hume is trying to criticize the design argument, but he summarizes it. He has Cleanthes summarize it. Remember, Hume's book is called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, and whether you call it natural religion or natural theology, as Paley does, it basically means trying to see if we can conclude something for or against the existence of God from what we observe in nature. That is, apart from any specific claims to revelation of some book. So, Cleanthes compares the universe. Now remember, the word Cleanthes is a made-up name from Hoanthropos, the Greek word for man or human. We get the word anthropology, right? The study of human culture. It's that word put together with Hotheos, the name for God. So Cleanthes is an intellectual believer who wants a rational faith, but still wants to portray God as having human characteristics, like beneficence, love, as well as intelligence, like human intelligence. So, while Damia, the other character who doesn't appear much in the discussion of the design argument, is a more or less believer of very simple faith. He would be like a fundamentalist. Damia doesn't like it that the design argument isn't an airtight, logical argument like the ontological argument. But that's not Hume's quibble with it. Now, Philo is the skeptical philosopher. So the character Philo is basically in the dialogue advancing Hume's own views. So Cleanthes gives us the design argument in summary, not because Hume is trying to convince us of its worth, but he's trying to summarize it for his readers so that he can then go on and criticize it. Okay? And I told you, especially in like your term paper, but even in your essays, it's a good idea to summarize what you're supposed to discuss before you go about giving your own views for or against. In other words, you're not writing to Professor Murawski when you're writing your term paper. You're writing to an imaginary reader who is intelligent enough to understand the things you're writing on, but who is theoretically uninformed and needs to be brought up to speed on what you're writing on. You know. So you don't want to write it as as if it's me writing another professional philosopher by email, where we both presuppose a certain level of background understanding. Part of the reason you're writing test essays and you're writing your term paper is to demonstrate to the professor that you understand this stuff. It's not understood that you understand this stuff. Get a PhD in philosophy or even a master's degree, and I'll be willing to assume that you understand this stuff. So moving on here. The basics of the analogy he gives is he compares the universe to a huge machine. And people back then were enamored, they were impressed with the fact that the laws of gravity and planetary motion that Newton and Galileo had given them were so exact that they could predict an eclipse down to the minute. So the whole universe was thought to be a clockwork universe, like a big mechanism that works as predictably as a clock. So the universe is like a machine that contains an indefinite number of smaller machines. And when we're talking about smaller machines, we're talking about other things in nature that are complex mechanisms, like the parts of the bodies of plants and animals, you know. So what are we supposed to conclude from the design argument? Well, not only that God exists as the designer of the universe, but that God is similar to us in that if an intelligence is needed to design and build the things we design and build, like ships and houses, then God has intelligence, and more intelligence than we do, because things in nature like the eye, the ear, the brain are much more complex than the things that we build and design. So the conclusions that God is intelligent and also has a larger intelligence than we do. Now, Philo again is Hume, the skeptical philosopher, and his quibble with the design argument is not that it's an argument from analogy, because Hume is willing to admit that there are some good arguments from analogy, and good arguments from analogy come about especially when you're comparing exactly similar cases, like one stone rolling down a hill versus another stone rolling down a hill, or whether fire can burn your finger in this case because it burned your finger in another case. I like to talk about exactly similar matches in a book or a box of matches, right? You take the second match out and you strike it and you expect it to do exactly what the first match did, because you're comparing apples with apples, like we say. One of my colleagues likes to give away apples down the hall. Anyway, you're comparing exactly similar things. And Hume says if you've got an argument from analogy that's comparing exactly similar things, you have an extremely strong argument. And now, the point he wants to make, though, is the less similar the things you're comparing, the weaker is your argument from analogy. The weaker evidence it gives for the conclusion you want to draw from it. And also, ultimately, he says, if you're comparing two things that are very dissimilar, you may even end up with a wrong conclusion. And the way Hume tries to educate his readers, to bring them up to speed on what an argument from analogy is trying to do, is by talking about circulation of blood. If we're trying to compare exactly similar situations, circulation of blood in one human being versus circulation of blood in another, he says, there you've got exact cases. That's like two matches out of the same box. And he says it's an extremely strong argument to conclude that blood circulates in one human being just like it does in another. But he says, suppose you've got cases that are similar but not exactly similar. And I told you about frogs. They do have a circulatory system. I don't know if anybody does this experiment. I actually had students recently say they saw this done in biology class or wherever, where you dissect a frog that's live and you open it up and there's a little heart beating, right? And you know it's got a circulatory system. So Hume says you can compare things that aren't really very similar, but still are similar enough to give you a good argument from analogy, that blood circulates in humans much like it does in frogs and vice versa. But Hume says, what about if you were trying to compare two things that aren't very much alike at all, that have maybe superficial similarities? He says you could even be led into a wrong conclusion. And here he says, look, there is similarity. If any of you have ever cut a corn stalk open, or you look at a plant and you see, and this is the same in trees, that there are little tubules where sap runs. Sap is a liquid like blood. There are some similarities, right? There are little tubules that seem to be like veins in a human being that the sap flows through. But Hume says we would be absolutely wrong to conclude that sap in vegetables circulates like blood in a human being. In fact, we're at the time of the year when all that sap, when the weather gets cold, goes down to the roots. That's one reason why, maybe the primary reason why the leaves deaden and fall off. The chlorophyll goes down to the roots. The xanthophyll and the carotene, which turn the leaves yellow and orange, remain. And the point is, you got to read between the lines here, right? This is Hume, the skeptical philosopher, who is, for all practical purposes, an atheist, at best an agnostic. The difference being an atheist is somebody who absolutely denies God's existence. An agnostic, that comes from the Greek word agnoio, I do not know. An agnostic says, well, maybe there is a God, but I don't know one way. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. I don't know one way or another. I'm just going to stand back from that question and not worry about it. Well, Hume's probably an atheist. And you see what he's saying here, right? He thinks that the design argument is not a good analogy because it compares man-made things like houses and ships. It's Paley who discusses the watch, not Hume, to the universe as a whole. And Hume says this is not comparing apples with apples, but comparing apples with oranges, comparing apples with something else, trying to compare things that are dissimilar. And can you read between the lines here, right? Just as we might be led by comparing two things that were very dissimilar, had only superficial similarities, like the plant and sap in the plant or the tree to blood in a human being. So he says we might be led to make a wrong conclusion, like that there's an author and designer of the universe, i.e. God. I think that's where he's really implying here. So what makes an analogy weak or strong is the similarity of the cases you're comparing. And the more dissimilar they are, the weaker the analogy, and an argument from analogy that's very weak may even lead you into a wrong conclusion. So, in the design argument analogy, to what is the building of a house compared? Well, the making of the universe by God. And Hume says these are comparing two very different things. Comparing a man-made object, then, like a house, to the universe is like comparing circulation of blood in a human being to sap in vegetables, is essentially the point he's making here. So Philo's view of this analogy then is that it's very weak and isn't a good argument. Now, he changes his emphasis here. Essentially, I built this PowerPoint from the primary text, or at least from a selection from the primary text in a book, textbook we used to use up in Carroll County, where I taught for a number of years. Order and design. Hume says, as we look around, yes, we perceive order. And he and Darwin are on the same page here. Darwin says, yeah, when we look around at nature, we perceive order. But the point that Hume makes is that order does not always imply design. That is, designed by an external intelligence as the cause of that order. So Hume says, even if we do see order in nature, and here he's not a scientist, but he speculates, because he knows something about the science of his day, he says there can be alternative explanations for that order, like that there are forces in nature like heat and magnetism or whatever that are responsible for order that aren't designed. And I told you about sugar crystals, about rock candy, right? You heat up sugar, dissolve it in water, put a string in there, let it cool. Crystals form that look as perfect as the diamond that a watchmaker deliberately designs and cuts. But that order comes about strictly as a result of how the molecules obey the laws of nature. Now, of course, the theist would say, yeah, okay, but who put the laws of nature in effect? You know? I mean, think about this. Think about this. For almost everything, the solid form of something is heavier than its liquid form. If that were the case with water, things in your local pond would be in dire straits, right? Because the water would freeze on top, and then it would go boom down on the bottom of the pond, taking every living thing with it. But that's not what happens. You and I know that's not what happens. The ice floats on top. Why? Because in the case of water, the crystalline form is lighter than the water is. So ice floats on water. And you can say, isn't that a serendipitous, lucky accident of nature that happens? But a theist would say, you really think that's just an accident? Or was there an intelligence that designed it and knew that water had to behave that way? and have that kind of a crystalline structure and build the laws of nature such that that's the way water behaves. At any rate, I told you, I don't care what position you write your essay from. It's going to be graded on independent factors. But I'm a theist. When it comes to this, I told you, man, I'm like Hume. Hume says in his book on miracles that he also always takes the lesser miracle. And when I was in high school, younger than you are, I read a book by a scientist named Lecomte de Noy called Human Destiny. And, you know, it's very easy to make the evolutionist case if you start out with organisms that are already complex enough to adapt to their environment. It's very easy to say, okay, you've got in the struggle for existence some members of the species developing advantageous characteristics like more complex eyes to adapt to their environment. And this happens over the case of millions of years until you finally get our eye by totally natural forces. That's not my problem with evolution as an entirely naturalistic process. My problem comes way before that. What Lecomte de Noy did was work out how improbable it is for even one strand of DNA to be produced by entirely naturalistic forces. And the probabilities against it are absolutely enormous. So I said, for me, I always take the lesser miracle. And for me, it's a far less of a miracle to think that an intelligence is responsible for those first strands of DNA, i.e. God, than the forces of nature. You know, now you can believe what you want to believe, but that's the position I took when I was in high school, and I'm a little older than that now, and I haven't seen any reason to change from that. Anyway, let's get back to this. So he says there might be internal causes of order, and as I said, Hume's a non-scientist. He's writing about 60 or 70 years before Darwin. Darwin publishes in the 1840s for the first time. Here's Hume writing in probably the 1760s when he's actually writing it. He died in 1776. And Darwin does fill in some of the blanks in Hume's argument, about evolution and the naturalistic process. So, but, okay. Now, Philo says, well, theists like Aquinas, want to conclude that there's one designer of the universe, the God of the Bible and church tradition. But basically, Hume as Philo says, why is that the only possible conclusion? Why couldn't we also conclude that the universe was designed by a committee, as houses and ships are built by a number of different? In that case, if there were a committee of gods building it, or designing and building the universe, we wouldn't need, each individual god wouldn't have to have the properties that God has in monotheism. Or why couldn't we get from how messed up this world is that the God who designed it was an infant deity just learning to make universes in the same way that somebody taking their first pottery course is learning how to make a vase, and they screw up their first try, And he says, why couldn't this universe have been the product of an infantile deity who botched it up and just left it alone, went his way to try again? Or an old senile deity who used to design some pretty good worlds, but now just can't pull it off anymore. So now you got to understand where Hume's coming here. He's making a logical point. He's not trying to say that Hume, thinks it's more believable to think that the world was designed by committee or by some senile old deity or some incompetent infant deity than that the world was designed by the God of the Bible and church tradition, the God of monotheism. Hume's not saying that these are better possibilities, but he's saying from a logical perspective, they can just as easily follow from the premises of the design argument than the conclusion that people like Aquinas would want to draw. So he's saying the argument is inconclusive. But I think somebody like Paley, and Paley wrote after Hume, would just simply say, well, oh, okay, sure, Hume, I'll give you that logical point. Yeah, there are other possibilities that are logically possible, but how seriously should we take any of them as alternatives to the God of monotheism? Okay, moving right along here, because I want to get you up with the other class, and we only have 2 minutes. So these alternative options then to design as a cause of order are internal to the mechanism. But so for Philo, the design argument doesn't even necessarily lead to the conclusion that there was only one designer. It could just as easily lead to the conclusion that the designer of the universe is many. And does Philo seem to agree with Cleanthes that the whole of a rational theology can be based on things like the design argument? Well, he obviously doesn't, because he thinks that you don't get a clear, unique conception of God as the designer from the design argument. And most theologians look at these arguments from natural theology as kind of icing on the cake. It's not what the main bulk of their faith is based on, So we're up to the meditations part, which we did most recently. But I'll go through that. So we'll continue some review on Friday. I don't know if that's going to take the whole period. I may start us on empiricism, even though you won't be tested on it. I may start us on what we're going to do next. And empiricism will be on the final. So turn in your essay on time Monday, 1.5 to 3 type double-space pages. Why double-space? There's a method to our madness. As I told you before, when you submit an article to a journal, they want triple-spaced or more. Why? Because several reviewers are going to make comments, and they want space for those comments to be there. Well, we want things typed double-spaced, not only because it's easier for us to read than reading 40 essays in a row from 2 classes that are single-spaced, but because it's easier for me to put comments that'll help you on your next essay. So there's a reason to have it double-spaced. Don't compose this thing on your cell phone, folks. Do it on a word processor where you can double-space stuff properly. See you all. Take care.